Who Gets to Decide? A liberty-based podcast that brings a little piece of sanity to a confused society drowning in a culture of craziness. And here is your host, Seth Martin.
Well, all right. What's up, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Who Gets to Decide. This is episode 651. I'm Seth Martin, your host. Thank you for joining me this evening. Glad you're here, and always happy you're listening. The ceasefire is still intact. This is Sunday, April 12th. I'm going to release the show probably Monday or Tuesday, but as of recording of this show, the ceasefire is still intact. By all accounts, maybe everybody but Israel has the intention of winding this conflict to an end, and we'll see. Okay, that's all we can do is wait and see. We're not in power, so we can't control any of these outcomes, and all we can do is speculate as to what might happen and hope for the best. Today I wanted to, this Professor Jiang guy, he did an interesting thing, and he took questions from like Twitter and his Substack and people asking him questions, just, I guess everyday Americans. I didn't recognize any big names in there asking questions. But he just took some questions, and I thought the questions were interesting, but also the answers were equally interesting. And I thought, we would play some of them here and just go through some of this. Yeah, so these questions are interesting, and I thought we would just go through some of them and discuss them here on the program. Some of them, when we start getting into family and community and how do you survive these conflicts and things like that, I want to address not what he's saying directly, but what I've said on this show in the past, and my belief in individual liberty and freedom, and how these don't really, it appears that he's contradicting me, and I want to address that too, because this is a very important part of my show, is all we need is liberty. And free money or honest money. And a lot of these problems will go away. Now, I'm going to talk about that also when he starts talking about the elites and the parasitic class and how America used to not be that way but is now. And we're going to expound on that a little bit as well. So there's a lot of, you have to understand that these questions are in the context of war. And of course, anytime you're grouped together and acting with common goals, that group is going to be successful over a bunch of individuals. But remember that this is not in contrast to what I'm talking about. I mean, if you look at our money, it says e pluribus unum, okay? And what that translates to is from many, one, okay? In other words, we created a society of many, but the idea was to protect individual liberty, property rights, and individual freedoms, things like this. And then you collectively add all that together and you get a society of many, okay? When you look at something like the United States versus, the old Soviet Union, there's still collections of people, right? The difference is when you have individual liberty and property, an incentive system sets up for an individual. And then you just replicate that out through all the millions of individuals. In a communist society, the core part of it, and the reason I'm bringing this up now is because we talked about this in a couple episodes ago with this Richard Wolff character. And the problem that you run into with a communist society is you can't just look at it as community better than individual, because there's different circumstances, right? In war, yes, community is better than the individual. But there's a way to get a community in a society of individuals, and there's also a way to get a community in a society of communists. And they're different, okay? They're different incentive structures. And the only thing that those two things have in common is community. But one is kind of a forced community. You're going to be a worker, okay? And we're all going to unite around this common goal of being a worker. And the incentives in America are based on individual liberty. And individual liberty is something that everybody can get behind, whether you're a multi-billionaire, or you're an individual working on an assembly line. The problem in America is we've strayed from that. And we're going to touch on that in a minute on one of these questions that gets asked, because it appears to contradict what I say on this program. And I just want to point out that it's not a contradiction. We're talking specifically in the context of war. But it doesn't mean that you couldn't. I mean, just look at World War II. A bunch of Americans got together and fought in World War II. How did that happen if we had a bunch of individuals? Well, the reason is because we thought we were fighting for our very freedom, our very liberty, okay? And that is something that you can get people to coalesce around, right? It doesn't have to be around, I don't know. It doesn't have to be around some of these other things that we talk about. In fact, one of the reasons, I mean, you could make an argument that one of the reasons we have not been successful in wars since World War II is because the individual liberty portion, the part that we all believe in, freedom and justice for all, has been under attack the whole time since World War II. Okay? And maybe you can even argue that it's been under attack since 1913, but it just, with the creation of the Federal Reserve, but it's only been, after World War II that the cracks have really started to appear and really impact our ability to go do things like wage war, okay? Have a Manhattan Project and all get behind it and feel like that we're doing the right thing, okay? All right, so I want to play Professor Jiang. I think these questions, I'm not playing all of his questions. There's too many. You should go watch the episode yourself. There's a whole interesting front part where he talks about history and how it proceeds and who are the players involved, from the prophetic, the occultist, to the agents, to the secret societies. And that's all very interesting too. I mean, I've never heard anybody explain that in the way that he did. And so I thought that was interesting, but that's not the topic of today's show. We're cherry picking some of these questions, and we're going to listen to his answers, and in some cases critique them, in other cases agree, but then flush out some other ideas along the same lines. All right, so let's continue here.
So this question is, why would the world be dependent on American fertilizers, energy, when the other parts of the world have energy and fertilizers as well? And the answer is trade access, okay? What America can do that other nations cannot do is basically retreat into its continental fortress and control sea trade, okay? So right now, the easiest way to trade is through the sea. And unfortunately, for the world, America controls the seas with its navies, okay? So what America can do is basically allow its ships to go anywhere in the world and block Chinese, Iranian, Russian ships from accessing the rest of the world. Now, a counter to this is that, you don't have to go by sea. If you were to unite Europe, Asia, and Africa and the Middle East, you can just use railways, and that's what China wants to do. The problem is Iran. That's why America is so invested in destroying Iran, because Iran is really the pivot of the world. If you can destroy Iran, it'll be very hard for China to access Belt and Road, and hard for Russia to trade with Africa. Okay? All right.
So, interesting concept, and I don't disagree. One of the things he brought up in this that I want to point out is what he calls America's continental fortress. Just retreat into North America and trade, develop our economy domestically, and trade with the entire world. This is how much of America's history was. In other words, so he's basically talking about going back to the way we used to be. Okay, don't extend your military forces out all over the world. Just retreat into defense of America, the common defense, and just trade. Just trade with the world. Use your Navy to secure trade routes, and that's all you need to do. Now, he presents this Chinese Belt and Road project as a threat to that. or at least America's perception of the Chinese Belt and Road Project would threaten our ability to just retreat into our continental fortress and trade with the world, keep the sea lanes open with the Navy, and just trade with the world. See, again, this is in the context of war, okay? So he's talking about, a lot of this he's talking about in the context of war with Iran, and why is the American empire fighting with Iran, you know? And so my position is always that we don't have to fight with Iran, okay? What we could do is do what he said at first, just retreat into our continental fortress, keep the sea lanes open, and trade with the rest of the world. The other thing we can do is adopt honest money, okay? To the extent, you know, China is not willing to adopt honest money, the Belt and Road Project won't succeed anyway. Okay, so if they do accept honest money, then great. All of the world will be richer for it. Okay, but if we just unilaterally said, okay, the dollar is going to be backed by gold, or we did something to go back to honest money, whatever that something is. And let's say China wanted to do the Belt and Road Project and try to strengthen the yuan out of that would simply not work. Capital would flow to where the honest money is. And the dishonest money, or the fiat money, would maybe initially people might flow into that because the prices are cheaper or so on and so forth. But over time, if that's based on fiat, money will flow out of that and into the places where money is protected. So that's kind of an alternative option that I saw in that particular question that he didn't really address. Now, but in all fairness to him, he's not looking at what is the best way to set up, you know, a global economy. He's saying he's looking at questions in the context of this conflict with Iran. All right, let's look at the next one here and see what this one's about. This is something I've talked about on this program too before, is the myth of the nation state. And you don't really hear people say this very often. You'll hear libertarians say it, but you don't really hear people outside of libertarianism ever assert that the nation state is a myth. It's a construct. It's not real. Okay. And I just thought his explanation of why it's not real was kind of interesting, especially given that I'm a libertarian, you know, and I've never heard anybody other than libertarians say this.
Why don't Asian and Middle Eastern nations unite to prevent American interference driven by its own interests? Okay. Yeah. Okay, another misconception is that the nation state, it is real. It is not real. It's just a made-up concept, okay? The idea of China, the idea of America, the idea of Russia, Iran, they're all made-up concepts. They don't exist. What these nation states are a collection of interests. Collection of elite interests. And all this means is that the people don't matter, okay? The people are a resource to be exploited by the elite. What matters is the elite. So the question then is, where are the elite, where are their allegiances, where are their loyalties? And the fact of the matter is that in East Asia, in the Middle East, much of the elite have their family and have their wealth all stored in the Western world. So they're not loyal to the people. They are never loyal to the people. They're loyal to themselves, to their families, to their social network. And because all of their wealth and family is located overseas, they're loyal to overseas. So these elite in Asia, in the Middle East, they are basically carpetbaggers, okay? And that's why we have this situation. And that's why, as things progress, nations that have very close relationships with the Western world, for example, the GCC, they are much likely to fall. They're much likely to collapse because these are very unstable countries. Whereas countries like Iran that have been isolated, ostracized by the West, are much more cohesive. Okay?
All right. So let's, yeah, this is an interesting concept, and just the idea of saying that the nation states are not real is an interesting concept, and he has a very specific way of looking at it. Countries like Oman and the UAE, These are, first of all, they're not natural places where people can live. The reason they live is because we have this modern world, and this modern world provides air conditioner and cheap energy, and it allows people to live in a desert. Okay, we can have desalination plants and things like this. So the other thing is, there's not like a shared vision to die for. Okay, like, let's just back up. Where was America's shared vision? Well, I used to say on this program all the time that, we used to believe in a handful of things. I mean, everybody knows that people from New York and people from Texas are very different, and people from California and people from North Dakota are very different. Everybody knows that, right? And so the question was, what makes America? What creates the cohesiveness? And if you go back about 75 years and prior to that, it was just a handful of things, right? It was the belief in free speech, gun rights, the rule of law. It's just a handful of things. It's like 5 things. I used to say, apple pie and baseball, but the point is, I mean, that's kind of a joke, but the point is things that people are willing to die for, like freedom, like liberty for their family, and opportunity that just you can do anything you want to do. You can become anything you want to be in America. All this is governed by principles that undergird this collective belief in America. Okay, the belief in private property, the belief in the rule of law, the belief in free speech, all these things, if you look, for the last 100 years have been under attack. Okay, and the question is, I mean, there's several questions, but one of the questions is, why is this under attack? Because what's been happening in America since America was created is what is generally referred to as counter-revolution. Okay, essentially, the people that wanted a strong central authority, the idea of America was you distribute power among these states, okay, and among the people. And some people didn't like that. They liked the idea of having a central authority. And so essentially, before the ink was even dry on the Constitution, there have been people working to make America more like France, let's say, okay, where you have a strong central authority and the elites can easily kind of create this mercantilist system where they use government power to advantage themselves over the rest of us. And the closer we've gotten to that, the worse your life has become, the worse my life has become, and the less we collectively believe in this thing that keeps us together as America. That's the idea, right? And of course, the people that did this, they did this for money. They ran a counter-revolution in America because they did it for money. But they didn't realize that they were undermining the very esoteric thing that you can't quite put your finger on that makes America, America. Okay? And what he's saying is, in countries like Iran, where they've had to kind of fend for themselves and they're isolated against the rest of the world through sanctions and whatever, they're very cohesive. They strongly believe that if they don't stick together, they're going to die. Okay? And that is a very difficult foe to take on, especially with a fragmented society like America has. I mean, we're just not on board, right? We got 1,000 different opinions. I was talking to a friend of mine that I worked with, and she's from Singapore, and she was talking about how in America, everything's, you try to do something, and it's like, everybody's bitching and moaning and complaining and whatever. She goes, in Singapore, we just decide to do something and we just do it. And I said, yeah, but you're all the same. You all look the same. Your elite class hasn't permeated the society in a way that it has in America to basically steal from all of you. I was trying to explain some of these things, some of these differences, but anyway, it's kind of hard to do. It's kind of like asking the fish, how's the water? I've used that analogy before. But yeah, these societies that are ancient societies that have very cohesive cultures, and is not, they haven't been poisoned with multiculturalism. These are very strong societies, and you're going to have to beating them in something like a military conflict is not going to be an easy thing to do, So, and it also explains why, India basically just falls in line with what America wants to do. Europe more or less falls in line, and they're pushing back a little bit, but Europe is its own really kind of thing militarily and stuff, but there are many, many countries, Australia, New Zealand, Japan, these countries are looking to the West, and they're going to do basically what we want them to do, okay? They're vassal states of the West. So I thought this was the most interesting thing I thought about this is that he's saying that nation state is not real. It's not a real thing. And I thought that was very interesting because I've actually said that multiple times. But all right, let's jump into the next clip. This one is about somebody's kind of posing the question about U.S. collapse, and he's answering that. Again, in the context of war and, not what's going on at this very moment, but what could happen, okay? And, of course, none of us really know what the future looks like. We're just speculating.
The petrodollar collapses, okay? Let's pretend the petrodollar collapses. AI collapses, treasury bond collapses. Will the U.S. not suffer an economic and development catastrophe, which is not part of the U.S. plans? Yeah, this is a good question, but you have to understand, again, a nation state is a collection of different interests. And these interests are competing against each other. Okay, so you have different interest groups. You have AI, you have finance, you have resources. Okay, and so what matters is the general direction of the country. So if the economy were to collapse, the main losers would be finance and AI, okay? But then what America can do, because it's so wealthy and its people are so energetic, is, well, let's just focus on building resources, okay? Oil, food, water, fertilizer. Let's just make this stuff and sell it to the world. Then the economy rebounds, okay? So this is actually a restructuring. Okay? Something we talked about before, where the purpose is not to destroy America, the purpose is to move power away from one elite to another elite, okay? This is basically a revolution in America. AI can actually be saved, okay? With government bailout. And that's what I imagine will happen, okay? AI and finance, the bubbles will burst, finance will be allowed to collapse, AI will be bailed out, because Trump is very close with these AI overlords like Peter Thiel and Sam Altman. And then resources manufacturing, okay, will become the dominant center of gravity in the American economy. Okay, so that's a plan. I'm not saying this will happen exactly like this, but that's what they intend to happen.
Okay, yeah. Before we get into this, I want to. He's talking about this collection of interest and elites. A lot of people don't know this, but even when there were kings, I know in American history we kind of learned that, the kings, ruled with absolute authority and they were tyrannical and all this kind of stuff. But that's not actually true. I mean, even when there was a king, there was a collection of interest that the king had to manage. Okay. So what he's talking about is it's always true. It doesn't matter if you have a monarchy or you have a democracy, or you even Putin in Russia has a collective of interest that he has to manage. Okay, and if he's going to invade Ukraine, for example, he can't just do that unilaterally. He has to have support from this collective group of interests, and so this is just kind of this really kind of goes unnoticed in when we're talking about what should America do, or what is America going to do, or what is this country going to do. You have to realize that there's a lot of people involved in these decisions, which is kind of the problem with this particular thing and the way it happened. Is Trump almost like knee jerk? I mean, I can just envision, Netanyahu picks up the phone and calls him and says, "Hey man, the whole leadership for Iran is in one room. We can bomb them right now. What do you think? Will you be behind us?" And Trump had, maybe had to make a decision, and he said, "Sure, go, let's decapitate them," and problem solved, right? He was looking at it, very narrowly. I mean, you can just see that this is probably what happened. And then next thing you know, They're pushing back. We're trying to call ceasefire. They're saying no. I mean, all of a sudden now it's out of control, right? It was very lucky. The only reason I think we got a ceasefire at this point is because Trump agreed that Iran's original 10 points were a good framework for negotiation. But it's quite possible that whole negotiation breaks down and we get right back into it with Iran and this thing spirals way out of control. Just as a side note, okay? But these interests, I think what's at Trump's thinking and his administration's core thinking is that some of these interests that make up our elites in America are out of control, okay? The finance side is way out of control. The dollar is losing so much value that it's hurting individual Americans, and politically that could cause problems. And so I think he's looking at, that's why Dr. Jiang here is talking about restructuring. I think someone like Trump and his guys that are talking tariffs and all these kinds of things, they're trying to restructure the balance of power in the elite class because it's gotten out of control. It's not working for Americans anymore. And we've been talking about that for a long time. That shouldn't be news to anybody here. And so what Jiang is talking about here is a rebalancing of these elite interests, knocking some of them down a peg, maybe bolstering others, but all done in a way that it brings manufacturing back to America. The average person is not having to work at McDonald's anymore to try to survive. I mean, you got factory jobs. I think they envision something like that. And maybe it'll work. I don't know. I don't have any sense one way or the other of whether or not that'll work. I think if you had honest money, a lot of this stuff just works itself out because it doesn't allow people to just borrow money and short the dollar. You know, I mean, if the dollar is backed by something real, then those actions don't work anymore. You know, the whole idea about owning a bunch of assets and just letting them, inflate value over time. If you had honest money, that particular thing just doesn't work anymore. So I don't really have an opinion on it. I just thought it was interesting that he thinks there's going to be a restructuring, and maybe this could lead to, let's say, finance getting knocked down a peg, maybe some version of honest money. Maybe we default on our debt and that collapses the financial group. And, I don't know. I just thought this was kind of an interesting thing that he was saying. And, Dr. Jiang, one of the things he talks about later he lets himself imagine certain scenarios. This is part of the way his methodology works. And so I'm probably less good at that. I'm not sitting here dreaming up things we ought to do or shouldn't do, but that's part of his philosophy or the way he kind of thinks through problems. All right, let's jump into this next one. I thought this was interesting because we struggle with discovering the truth, right? How do you discover the truth? He's going to take on this question. We started talking about this way back when Elon Musk bought Twitter, and you had the Twitter files, and all this government collusion was uncovered. And we talked about the reason you need the free flow of information is because truth is something that's discovered. It's not something that, somebody can just stand up and say, this is the truth. The truth ministry, there's no such thing. The truth, if you develop a truth ministry, the truth ministry, the truth will evade the truth ministry, right? There's just no way to just pronounce truth, okay? Not unless you're like Jesus Christ, you're going to put your feet on the earth and say, this is truth. I am the truth and the way and the life, okay? That's what Jesus did. But in the human world, that doesn't happen that way. It's a discovery process. Well, you'll just hear what he has to say about it. I think he's not saying anything contradictory to what I say. And so I thought it was just interesting to get his perspective on this, though.
How do we combat the war against truth? How do we engage in discussion that transcends our biases? Okay, we all live in fantasies How do we overcome this? What techniques do you employ in your research? All right, okay. Things that I do that I think are very important is, first of all, doubt. You always want to question yourself. You always want to ask yourself, am I correct? That's why making predictions is important. Because making predictions, it's actually about creating doubt in yourself. Because if the predictions are wrong, it's a mechanism for you to self-reflect and appreciate the limitations of your model, okay? So that's one strategy. Another strategy is debate. Okay? Where you engage in people who think differently than you do. And I do that by watching a lot of YouTube videos, and I try to watch people of different political leanings, who have different viewpoints than because I'm interested in hearing their perspective, okay? So keep an open mind, engage in people who disagree with you, and have an honest debate with them as well as yourself. Now the last piece, and this is actually something that I do, but most people don't do, is I use my imagination. And all this means is I will go places, I will make certain assumptions that other people don't do, okay? That's why I think people find me so interesting, because I will say things that are imaginative, that are speculative, but which is not backed up by any evidence. Don't be afraid to do that, okay? If you want to seek the truth, you have to make some imaginative leaps into the unknown in order to find the truth, okay? The truth is not in front of you. The truth is often behind you or far away from you, okay? So you don't be afraid to just leap far, okay? Into the unknown. All right.
All right, well, that's an interesting perspective there about truth discovery. And for me, it's very much the same way. Debate was the one that struck me hit me the hardest, is when you debate someone, they're kind of fighting for their ideas very fervently, and you're fighting for your ideas fervently. And that's something that this show doesn't have, right? We don't have that. Now, I can present somebody's, like we did this with Richard Wolff, I presented his arguments, and then, I would come on and I would rebut them, and I'd give you my reasons for why those are not correct or whatever. But then, Dr. Wolff was not here to take on my rebuttal, which is kind of missing part. It's a missing part of the debate. But doubt is another thing that I think is very important. Often you'll hear me talk about humility or being humble or just having the knowledge that you don't know everything. That, and this is kind of a lack of, this is what I think is lacking in our political process. And when I watch, one of the reasons it disgusts me to watch things like CNN and Fox News and MS Now and these corporate media outlets is the people are speaking with such confidence in their ideas. There's just no possibility they could be wrong. There's no possibility that the government could be wrong. That really bothers me. And it's one of the reasons I kind of developed this show is I wanted to address these things, like point out that, no, this is not necessarily right. In fact, it's a good chance it's wrong. And here's why, and because it doesn't follow the principles that undergird our society or whatever my argument was. And so now I do a fair amount of imagining myself. I don't necessarily share my imagination with you guys, not always. I have with respect to the financial system and money. I think if you look at something like the stock market, it's very easy to see in my mind that a huge chunk of, and this is something Michael Burry and other people have said, I'm not the only one, but it's easy to see this straight up and to the right kind of growth in the stock market as a big chunk of that is just monetary. Okay. It's just the decline in the value of the money. Okay. So it's not real. In other words, if I if I earn $1 million in the stock market, but that $1 million only buys 80% of what $1 million bought 10 years earlier, well, then I haven't gained anything in the stock market. You see my point? And so it's easy to use like the S&P divided by gold or something like that to demonstrate that largely what you have in the growth of the stock market is a monetary effect. And from that, it's easy to imagine that if you had like a monetary collapse or some problem with the monetary system, that a big chunk of that stock market growth would go away, 70, 80%, something like that. And this is not actually controversial. There are other people that say this as well. So this is kind of where I agree with Dr. Jiang. I mean, truth is something we have to work hard to get to, and we have to kind of argue about it. Okay. This is why our legal system is set up the way it is, and the way you have these advocates on opposing sides, because what you're trying to get to is the truth, or as closely approximate to it as possible, so that you can either establish reasonable doubt and again for the accused on behalf of the accused, or you can establish enough evidence that the accused is convicted, and we can legitimately say, well, there was due process there, and we're taking this person's liberty away from them, okay, because they're a killer or whatever. So, anyway, I thought Dr. Jiang's explanation was interesting. I had not heard that explanation before, but I think it's very useful, and there's a lot of parallels, I think, to what I've been saying here on this program. All right, let's jump into the next clip. The next clip is about, just how not all nation states are created equal. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, these countries don't have the same ability to extend force the way America, maybe Germany does, or China or Russia, countries like this. So I thought this was interesting and also important to understand when you're discussing these types of global events, is to understand that some of these countries they're not in the same league. I mean, it's not like we're bragging or anything. It's just they literally are not in the same league. All right, let's play that clip.
Okay. So Asia and Australia are suffering the most from this global conflict. Why are these nations passive? Won't these nations intervene? Okay, again, a lot of this is misconception in that everyone thinks that the nation states are the constituent players in this game, and the nation states are all equal. They're not equal. They're not. Nation states, there are only certain nation states that have the capacity to project force overseas. Russia, America, maybe some European countries. Australia, Asia, and most European countries are just vassal states. They are not capable of playing this game. They're only capable of obeying. Okay? Maybe over time, they'll change the attitude and develop the capacity to play this game. But you have to remember that, like the GCC, a lot of these European countries, Japan, South Korea, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines, they're all co-opted by the CIA. Okay? These are all American vassal states. And so they're not capable of acting independently of American policy. There's the illusion that they are independent, but they're not. Okay? And you can tell because of their actions. In that, you're absolutely right in that, okay, if you're Australia and you don't have any more jet fuel, well, then you should send your army or negotiate with Americans or negotiate with Iranians. But they're not doing that, okay? Japan is, in fact, negotiating with Iran, but Japan is still a vassal state of America. Pakistan is the mediator for this ceasefire talk between America and Iran, but guess what? Pakistan is also just another vassal state, okay? They pretend not to be, but by their actions, you know that they are, in fact, vassal states. All right?
Okay. Another interesting concept, because, we talk about other nation states in terms of sovereignty, like when Russia invaded Ukraine. This is why the whole thing in Russia and Ukraine, this is why the whole thing was so foolhardy and so stupid. Ukraine really got played in that whole deal. The reason we think they're somehow equal is because people come on TV and they'll say Russia invaded a sovereign country. Like sovereignty is something that's real. Sovereignty is not even something that's real. Okay, sovereignty is something that you get because you're willing to, or you're able to exert force or extend force abroad. That's what sovereignty is. Now, I'm sovereign. I mean, we have the concept of sovereignty inside of America, like Seth Martin is a sovereign individual, meaning you can't assault me or you're not without going to jail, or you can't kill me, you can't take my life. I'm a sovereign individual. You can do it as long as we implement due process. We have a process for taking away someone's liberty. Okay. So even an individual in America is not fully sovereign because the state can take your liberty as long as they demonstrate due process. I think we sometimes overplay this idea of sovereignty. You can almost say that sovereignty exists as long as the state allows you to have it. It's kind of like the speed limit. If the speed limit sign says 65, but everybody's going 70 and nobody's getting pulled over, all right, let's continue. If nobody's getting pulled over, then the actual speed limit is 70. It's kind of similar in that way. But I thought this was interesting because, we don't normally think of this. We don't normally think of, we think of Australia as just, it's its own sovereign nation. It's its own, they have their own people, they have their own elections. But really, when you get right down to it, Australia is a vassal state of the West, of the U.S. Anyway, I just thought that was an interesting question and also an interesting answer. All right, let's jump into the next one real quick. The next one is about, this is another imagined thing. What if there's a civil war in America? And, who will benefit from a civil war? And that we've talked about on this program that civil war, just define our terms here real quick, okay? Civil war is when, let's say, a large geographical area, there are multiple factions fighting over control for the whole area. That's civil war. Okay. We've talked about in the past on this program that what happened in 1865 was not a civil war in America. It was the South leaving the Union. Okay. The Southern states were just leaving the Union and creating their own country. That's not the same thing as a civil war, because he's going to say some pretty controversial things about civil war here. Like, once a civil war begins, it almost never ends. And you could say, well, Dr. Jiang, the Civil War in America ended, it began and it ended. That's because what happened in America wasn't actually a civil war. Okay. That's evidence for we're calling it the wrong thing. It's more accurate to call what happened in America the Northern aggression against the South, the Northern War of aggression against the South in America. That's more accurate. And that's evidenced by the fact that he says, when you look at history, once a civil war begins, it never really ever ends. And I think that's interesting. I wish I had thought to use that to support my argument for what our Civil War actually was, not a civil war. It was the northern states launched a war of aggression against the southern states. That's what happened. The southern states were not fighting over control of Washington, D.C. That's not what was happening. Anyway, I just thought, just as a parallel to what he's going to be talking about here, I thought I would bring that up because we've talked about it here on the program. All right, here we go.
Civil war breaks out. Who's going to win? Christian nationalists, Silicon Valley versus the old man Wall Street, a city versus countryside conflict. Do you believe it will result in separation of the union into multiple factions? Okay, so if you look at the history of the Roman Republic, once a civil war starts, it almost never ends. Okay, that's just the nature of American society, where America is so vast and people there are so energetic and ambitious that once the Civil War starts, it's very unlikely that it will ever stop, okay? Maybe the intensity will shift over time, but you will have Civil War for the next few hundred years, okay? And the question then is, who triumphs? Okay, so if you just use our game theory formula, okay, of cohesion, energy, and openness, and you ask yourself, okay, let's just look at American society and ask yourself, which state has all three? The answer is Texas, okay? And this is pretty clear. If you just look at the 50 states and which state is the most dynamic, which is the most energetic, the most open-minded, it's gonna be Texas. California, New York are gonna suffer in a civil war. The economies will suffer a great deal, the societies will suffer a great deal. Texas will emerge as a clear winner in any conflict, okay? And with Texas, you also have Christian nationalists. And AI, okay? Why Christian nationalists? Because Christian nationalists is actually a coherent philosophy. It's coherent. It has a direction, it has a strategy, it has a purpose. Okay, so I think Christian nationalists will also win out. And then AI will win out because AI can provide the technological support to Christian nationalists, okay? So if you are working in Texas, if you live in Texas, and if you work in AI, and you're a Christian nationalist, well, you're gonna be a big winner of this civil war, okay? And if you're the opposite, okay? If you are maybe living in New York or California, and you work and you are maybe an atheist, and you, I don't know, work in arts, I don't know, you're gonna be a clear loser in this war, okay? Often these, what's called professional managerial elite, managerial elite living on the coast, these guys are done, okay?
All right. I thought this was an interesting concept. I don't think there's going to be a civil war in America, okay? I don't think that's going to happen. But one of the things that I thought was interesting, especially when he started talking about, let's say you live in California and you're an atheist and you're in the art business or something. One of the things I've talked about on this program a lot is that there is going to be a shift, I believe, away from these connected jobs, okay? Jobs that are, the reason you make $2 million a year is because you're connected to the government in some unique way that advantages you, okay, privileges you. When people talk about white privilege, like I don't think of white privilege as something of just being white. Privilege is something that somebody with more power has to give to somebody with lesser power. Like the U.S. Congress privileges GE to ban its incandescent light bulb and then codifies into law the compact fluorescent light bulb that GE is going to build in China and sell to Americans for $4.50. That's privilege, okay? That in other words, the U.S. government creates a law that privileges that corporation or privileges individuals in that corporation or whatever. To me, those are the losers, okay? The losers are going to be, and he talks about it in a minute. He talks about the elites as being parasites. Again, this counter-revolution thing that we've undergone in America since before the ink was even dry on the Constitution has been this counter-revolution. What's the counter-revolution all about, Seth? Well, it's about coalescing power in a smaller and smaller group, hands of a group of people, okay? At the expense of who? At the expense of you and me. We're the losers in that, right? Individual liberty and your ability to work hard and benefit from that work, that is all being undermined by this elite control, okay? So I think one of the losers, forget about the Civil War. Let's just say we go back to honest money. One of the biggest losers in an honest money trajectory are connected, people that get their livelihood either directly or indirectly from government. That's gonna suffer. That's why, I don't know if I ever told you all this story, but this guy came to my house and he wanted to put solar panels on my house. And he was giving me all these reasons. And financially, all these reasons make sense, okay? The government's going to subsidize it. Your electricity bill is going to go down, yada, yada, yada. And I told the guy, I said, look, and he was a sharp guy. This guy had really good sales skills. And so I told him, I said, look, you're a really sharp young man and you've got good sales skills. I mean, you're handling objections very well. I told him all the things he's doing really good. And I said, you should make a bunch of, go out and continue to do what you're doing. Make as much money as you can, but you need to keep your eye open for another opportunity because this one is going away. And he was like, well, why do you say that? He was genuinely interested. And I gave him the reason. I said, look, this is all subsidized and the debt is getting bigger and bigger. It's just not going to be like that in the future. It's not going to be subsidized forever. And nobody's going to buy this stuff if it can't be subsidized by the government. And so therefore your company is going to go bankrupt eventually. And the reason I don't want to buy anything is because your company and a bunch of other companies are going to go bankrupt and I'm going to have all this stuff on my roof. I'm going to have all this new infrastructure. And one day it's going to break and I'm going to need support. And there's not going to be anybody. There's not going to be anybody supporting this business. And now I'm going to have to pay somebody else to pull all this crap off my roof and un-engineer everything you guys engineered. That's why I'm not buying. I said, but you should go sell more and more of this and make as much money as you possibly can before it runs out, because it will run out. And I gave him the reasons why. And it's the same thing once you have a big collapse or the money system changes or something radically changes that changes the trajectory that we're on. And to me, it can only change. I mean, I guess it could get better. It could get worse. We could become more autocratic or more tyrannical. But I think the likelihood is it's probably going to go back in the other direction, back toward what the original founding was and individual liberty. And so that's going to depend on real skills. Do you have knowledge? Do you have skills that other people that participate in the market have and want and are willing to pay for voluntarily? That's going to be the real question. So it's kind of along the same lines as who are the big winners and losers out of the Civil War, same kind of thing. So if you're working in a government connected job, my recommendation would be to start looking at making a career change and getting out of that, because there won't be the money to support that in the future. All right, let's look at the next clip. I've got 3 more here. This one is very short. He talks about how do you survive this kind of situation, and he talks about family and community, and also he talks about I don't care if you have a bunker and you're rich or whatever. And I want to draw some parallels to this too, because we've talked about this on that particular aspect of this on this program before. So I want to remind some folks about what has been said previously in that area. All right, let's continue. All right, let's continue here.
All right. How does an individual survive for what's coming? Family and community, guys. Okay? Forget the fact that you are an individual. Leave that behind. You will not survive as an individual. I don't care how much money you have. I don't care how prepared you are. You might have a bunker. I don't know. I don't care, okay? But you have to focus on family and community if you are to survive the new world. All right.
All right. So, yeah. Now, you might say, well, that bodes better for communism or something, doesn't it, Seth? Community. Isn't that what communist is? A big, giant community? So, again, this goes back to America. Again, just read the money. E pluribus unum. Okay? From many, one. Okay? There's nothing about America's founding that says we can't have community, okay, or family or anything like that, okay? What we're saying is the best way to have strong communities, strong families, is to have individual liberty. Okay. That doesn't mean when the shit hits the fan, we go buy a bunch of prep food and load up our garage with it and defend it with weapons or whatever. That's not what that means. I think he's right. If you're going to survive some conflict or some depression or something like that, you're going to have to rely heavily on your family, and you're going to have to rely heavily on like-minded people in your community that are aligned with the same goals that you're aligned with. So I don't think that's controversial at all. I just thought the reason I wanted to play it is because it seems like it's contradictory to things that I talk about on the show, and I don't believe that to be contradictory at all. So, all right, let's we got two more here. One is kind of what we talked about. America was this great bargain, where you could, as an individual, you could rise as high as you were willing to go. But now we almost kind of work in this elite prison. Okay. So he talks a little bit about this, about the elites and how they've become stronger. And this may be one of the things Trump is actually up to, is to try to drive a wedge into this elite structure to weaken it for the American people. I mean, I don't know. I'm speculating, but it seems plausible. And especially when you listen to Jiang talk about kind of how it used to be in America and the way it is now. And it really lines up a lot with what I talk about on this program. All right, let's continue with that one.
If mass organization are the primary causes of imperial decay, why are unlimited population, unlimited land set as reasons that U.S. technet will succeed? Okay, all right. Look, I said the U.S. technet is the plan. I didn't say it would succeed. Yes, I understand. America can take over all of North America. It can occupy Canada. It can occupy Mexico, Cuba. But when it does that, it's going to create a lot of insurgencies. It's going to create a lot of conflict. It will be a dumpster fire, okay? Just because you are able to accomplish it doesn't mean you should accomplish it. It doesn't mean it'll be successful. Immigration trap. Why is conforming to rules and working hard considered playing the game wrong if high confidence requires resilience in the coming era of resource scarcity? Look, if the game is fair, you want to conform to rules and you want to work hard. But if there's an elite that is parasitic, that is rent-seeking, then by working hard, you're just transferring your energy to the elite. Okay? So before, maybe 20 years ago, America was a place that was very fair. And so if you just worked hard and played by rules, you would succeed. This is no longer true, where it's basically an oligarchy and where a few people control all the power, okay?
Okay, so yeah, he talks about it there, he calls it an oligarchy. I don't know if it's an oligarchy because, I mean, it's power comes through the political process, and it's concentration of power. Some people say concentration of wealth. But to me, the elite is being privileged. Okay, that's the correct way to think about it, I think. I mean, just look at Elon Musk. And I like Elon Musk, okay? I mean, I think when he speaks, people should listen to what he's saying. I think he's got a lot of good ideas, and also the way he thinks about the world around us is mostly accurate. But look at Elon Musk. Look at the businesses he's running, okay? Tesla. Now, some of you might just love Tesla, and you want to go on and on about how great Tesla is. But the fact is, for, I don't know, the first 15 years of Tesla's existence, you got a $25,000 tax deduction or a tax credit from the government if you bought a Tesla. He's essentially privileged. He's being privileged by the U.S. government to become rich, okay? Love him or hate him, that's just a fact, okay? Look at SpaceX. Do you think, is there a market for SpaceX outside of what the U.S. government wants to do? Of course not. Okay? So he's becoming wealthy because the government is privileging his companies. Okay? Do you get that privilege? Are you getting some sort of privilege from the U.S. government and becoming fabulously wealthy in America? No. Of course you're not. Okay? So this is what he's talking about. The elites, and you may like some of them, you may not. It doesn't matter whether you like them or not. The fact is, they're becoming fabulously wealthy in part by tax dollars that are confiscated from you and given to them. Okay? Now they're doing something for it, but it's not the same thing as a free market. Okay? And it's not the same thing as owning a business and not being a parasite. Okay? You can own a roofing business, and maybe you own hundreds of roofing businesses and you become fabulously wealthy. You're not a parasite on society. Okay? Those decisions for people to put roofs on their houses, those decisions are being made in a free market where people can voluntarily choose to buy a roof or not to buy a roof. I don't get to voluntarily choose how much of my tax money, if any, or maybe I don't want zero. Maybe I want zero going to SpaceX. Okay? Maybe I want zero going to Tesla. I don't get to choose that. Okay? That's not free market. That's what creates the parasitic relationship. Okay? Not the fact that we have elites. We could have elites without having a parasitic relationship. I mean, a lot of people don't like John D. Rockefeller. They think he was a robber baron or whatever. But the fact is, kerosene went down like 98% the bigger his company grew. Okay? And he was not being privileged by the government. Okay? He was operating in the free market. Okay? He was taking capital and deploying it in a way that made people's lives better, and he became fabulously wealthy, and people were able to light their homes and do things like that until electricity came along. Okay? Later on, they were able to put fuel in their cars and expand. Most people never went more than 15 miles away from their house. After ExxonMobil, John D. Rockefeller, people were traveling. I mean, the whole U.S. highway system was built as a result of that. Okay? And John D. Rockefeller, maybe he benefited from that, but it was built because, all these cars were created and roads need to be improved or whatever. Okay? So these are just, you can have elites without having parasitic elites, is my point. All right, this is the last point that he's going to talk about. It's reliance on technology, which I've talked about numerous times on this program, that we have this belief that technology can do all these things. And I think our beliefs are really not anchored in reality. And he kind of addresses that in the context of war. So I thought this was really interesting.
What if you can make cheap drones? Okay? So I say, the way to counter cheap drones is with a ground invasion. But America can make even cheaper drones, then wouldn't that solve the problem? And yeah, so the answer is this. We become too obsessed with technology. We think that technology can solve all the problems. And what you don't understand, what people don't appreciate, is that technology is built on people, okay? Technology is meant to complement people, to enhance the skills of people. Technology is not designed to replace people. That's the issue that America is facing in this war, where America thinks that by using sophisticated air defense, by using super carriers, by using fighter jets that are stealth, we can reduce civilian casualties and win the war. And it's turning out not to be the case. Why? Because people are much more creative, much more resilient, and much more determined than technology. Okay? So if you have a group of people together, they're always going to figure out a way to defeat your technology. So imagine this, okay? You build a robot, and this robot is invincible. Lots of machine guns, nighttime vision, 360 vision, okay? If I fight this robot one-to-one, I'm dead, right? But I'm a human being, I'm not stupid, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna lure this robot into a dark forest or a cave where the robot's gonna stumble and where I can maybe throw a rock or pour water on it, okay? But because technology, it's static, people are dynamic and creative, okay? And spontaneous. So that's what makes people so wonderful, because we humans, we're dynamic, we're creative, we're spontaneous. We're not afraid to die for what we believe in. A robot is just going to do what a robot's going to do. So it's completely predictable. We are not predictable, okay? That's why if you insist on using technology and drones as your main military strategy, you will lose this war. You have to commit your people to total war. You have to find people who are willing to die for what they believe in, and then you'll win this war. And that's why I believe that ultimately America will lose this war in Iran, because American people don't have the political will to fight this war. I don't care how much money you put in this war. You can spend $100 trillion. I don't care. I don't care how much technology you have. You're still going to lose this war unless you're able to galvanize the patriotism and political will of your people.
Okay. What's interesting about, especially the very end of this, what's interesting about this is how it dovetails with what your people believe in. So if you think about it like this, like he says 20 years ago, he talks about 20 years ago in the previous segment, America was fair. I don't think it was even 20 years ago. I think you have to go back even further than that. I think you have to go back probably to 1913 and the creation of the Federal Reserve. I mean, if you really wanted to get, like, there's two things to think about, okay? One is, what was the point where things started to move in the direction of unfairness? Okay, let's think of it like that. I think the creation of the Federal Reserve, I mean, we talked about it on the show many, many times. The 16th Amendment, the creation of the Federal Reserve, the 17th Amendment, these things really set in motion a path of nationalism and a parasitic elite class. Okay? Now, when did we Americans start feeling it? That's a different question. And we could argue about that. I would say probably in the late 60s, early 70s, Americans began to feel it. But what's interesting about this is, and what he's talking about here, is how these things are related to one another. Now, he didn't talk about how they're related. I'm saying they're related to one another. Because remember I talked about a minute ago, like you can coalesce a country around free speech, individual liberty, gun rights, the rule of law, things like that. Okay? But notice that we've chipped away at those things. Individual liberty, people tell me all the time, well, Seth, we're still basically free. Okay? But what we've lost is a lot of our economic freedom, economic liberty. And if you're not free economically, you're not free. Okay? That's just a fact. And so, as the elite class and these people that are kind of advocating for nationalism over a distributed power system like we traditionally had in America, one of the side effects of this is this chipping away at this cohesiveness of America. You used to be able to go, yeah, I love my brother in New York or California or South Dakota or Kansas or Louisiana or Virginia or whatever, because we had this common set of interest, right? We had this individual liberty, this free speech, and all this stuff is being undermined, has been undermined. And now when you look around and you say, okay, we got to go fight some major war for the survival of America, a lot of people are just become indifferent to that, because they're like, why do I want to fight for Lindsey Graham? I mean, that's what it's come down to, right? It's like, I think Lindsey Graham's a fucking idiot. I don't want to fight for that guy. Or I think Donald Trump's an idiot. Our political system has become about the Republicans and the Democrats and less about preserving our way of life, our belief system, our cohesiveness. And so I think these things are very much related. And it's one of the reasons why America has to turn away from this path that we've been on, and we've got to move it back in the other direction. The problem is now you've got this elite class that is just entrenched, okay? And let's pick on Elon Musk some more. Why is Elon Musk why would he just say, you're right, SpaceX is parasitic. We're just gonna we're going to fold up shop and go home. He's not going to do that because it's not in his interest to do that anymore. And so what we need to do is structurally create an America that essentially doesn't allow this privilege to get a toehold, and then totally change our elite class in such a way that now they become parasitic. This is what we should be after. Now, how do you do that? I don't know. I think you go to honest money. You use that amendment that I put forth. I don't think I still have a copy of it here. No, I took it down. But, I put forth an amendment 4 or 5 episodes ago where you basically structurally create an amendment that says that the primary function of the legislative branch is to protect liberty and property, and that no individual, no country, no corporation can be privileged at the expense of other Americans. And that's high level. Okay. There's like 4 parts to it, and you give the states power to recognize when particular laws are created to just nullify them on the spot. Forget the Supreme Court. We can't rely on the Supreme Court to nullify laws that are created by the same country, by the same global interests that are now weighing in on whether or not that law is legitimate or not. That's ridiculous. I think it's proven to be unsuccessful. All that kind of stuff is related. Now, technology, I agree with him. Getting back to the original point here, technology, we've deluded ourselves into believing that somehow technology is the answer to everything. And even to the point where we're afraid that technology, AI, is going to replace all our jobs. And, his point is like, look, no, technology doesn't replace people. Technology is used to make people more productive, make people more prosperous, make people more efficient. It works in conjunction with people. This is why AI, in the fearful sense, will fail. It will not. I don't think it'll do any of the things that they think it will do. Now the government could co-opt it and create a controlled grid. That's very possible, but it's not going to replace jobs. It's not going to do that kind of stuff. If you think about like what he just said a couple episodes ago when we were talking about Dr. Richard Wolff and his ideas and we were trying to shoot him down, we defined what capitalism is. Capitalism is just your labor, your skill set, your ability mixed with some technology to produce a more efficient and a more productive output. That's all capitalism is. So capitalism can also just be said that it's the intersection of technology and people. Okay? Labor is a particular subset of people, right? That's where capitalism really comes in. It works with labor, not just people in general, but labor. In an enterprise, you mix labor and technology to make the people more productive and make the company more profitable and so on and so forth. Anyway, just thought these are things that we've discussed on this program numerous times. And I just think it's interesting that these same concepts come back to whether or not you can win a war. How important is individual liberty in developing the cohesiveness in a country like America where we don't all look the same, okay? But we could all believe in economic individual liberty and prosperity and the rule of law that undergirds that and the free market system that undergirds that, right? That's something we could all go die for, okay? But when you spend the last 100 years undermining that, I don't think it's any secret that Americans don't want to go die for a bunch of people like Elon Musk. I mean, it's like, what's the point of that? I don't want to do that. And so, if you're ever going to have, the greatest generation again in America, you're going to have to roll all this shit back, and we're going to have to embrace the things that brought us to this point. Okay. Dick Vitale used to call these basketball games, and he used to have this saying, when you talk about who's going to win the playoffs and stuff, he would say, you got to go with the one that brung you. Okay, that was his saying. What he meant by that is the thing that made you successful is the thing you got to deploy in the championship. Okay? whatever brought you to the championship is the very strategy that you need to use to win the championship. And by the same token, the thing that brought America to be this massive juggernaut of political and economic power is the thing we need to go back to in order to preserve that juggernaut, right? Otherwise, we're going to lose it, okay? That's my thinking on this. Well, look, I've been talking for a while. I hope that was interesting to you. I just think this guy is really interesting to listen to. There's almost nobody, I can't think of anybody else really that's discussing the geopolitical globe the way Dr. Jiang is. And I think, you know, if you're so inclined, go support the guy, go watch his videos. Certainly watch this entire one that I'm going to put in the show notes page. But this guy will challenge your thinking in ways that nobody on Fox News or CNN or MS Now is going to, okay? We need to give up on all that. That's just can't be where we get our news. We're going to have to start getting our news this way. We need to bring real thinking back to the landscape that we live in and how we confront that and everything. So anyway, I hope that's enjoyable to you. I hope you see something here you might want to share with some other people, maybe expand the show. Go to YouTube, watch the show, subscribe. That'll help build the audience a little bit. But come back in a few more days and I'll have another episode for you here on Who Gets to Decide. Peace, everybody. Thank you.